Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Story of Us, presented to you by the World of Paleoanthropology. My name is Seth Choggy, your host, and today I am joined by Dr. Rob O'Malley, a wonderful science communicator who I have had some dealings with through the ABAs, and it's been a great time that I've had with him. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, Rob, and let us know, you know, why you're here a little bit.
Sure. So first, very glad to be here. Appreciate the invitation. So my name is Dr. Rob O'Malley. My pronouns are he and him, and I am a public engagement associate at a program called Personal Genetics Education and Dialogue, which is based at Harvard Medical School. And I've been a part of that program for about 2.5 years now. Prior to that, I was a senior program associate, and then I was a project director at the American Association for the Advancement of Science in the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion, or DOSER program. And so PG Ed, I should back up and say, so PG Ed is a public engagement with science program focused on genetics. And so we do a lot of education, public engagement work in that space. Um, my prior work at Dozer was more broadly about science in general, with a focus on faith community engagement.
That's very interesting. I think an aspect of science communication that's often overlooked. And I think it's something that if more resources were put into it could open the door for a much larger community. What do you think your biggest challenge is when you're communicating with, say, a religious group who has not been so comfortable with ideas of change over time and evolution?
Um, so in general, and we will probably talk more about this later, but where best practices in science communication are today in terms of what research and experience and practitioners are sort of converging on is that effective and impactful science communication, science engagement is audience centered, takes a model that is more interactional and um, dialogue focused rather than like knowledge transfer in one direction.
Mm,
Uh, puts science in its social, historical, and in some cases political context, and recognizing like the importance of values in science, that science is a thing that people do, and engaging with the challenges of trust and trustworthiness. Um, and so, in the faith community context, all of that is really central. Most people on Earth claim some religious or spiritual identity. As anthropologists, we know that, like, what it means to be religious or what it means to be spiritual can be hard to nail down. But most people on Earth do claim that identity. Many scientists claim that identity, and there are the United States context is not necessarily typical in terms of, in the United States, it's something like 30 or 40% of life science and physics PhDs claim some religious identity. Worldwide, that number is all over the map, sometimes much higher, sometimes lower. Um, and so this is just part of the human experience. And so I think this is a long-winded way of answering your question, but um, engaging with evolution or engaging with questions of human origins with faith community members of faith communities who may be skeptical or even hostile to ideas about human origin really starts with respect, really starts with um, acknowledging that like there's a difference of opinion, but if you'll pardon the pun, I'm always happy to have like good faith conversations about what we know, what we think we know, and where potential divergences exist in terms of people's understanding of the world. And the goal is not to convince, the goal is to understand.
mm. I think that's a very important point, one that kind of separates successful science communicators from people who are not doing as well when they're trying to communicate those ideas. So, Could you share a bit about your journey in science communication and what inspired you to enter the field in general?
Sure. So I was really fortunate to have a number of mentors going all the way back to my undergraduate days at Miami University of Ohio. Um, Instructors, teachers who really valued uh, engaging with science as it is, not like an idealized version of science, but as kind of
Hmm.
a messy human process. And also, like I was fortunate in taking a lot of anthropology courses fairly early on, which, I anthropology, there's lots to criticize about anthropology, but like as a discipline, but like one of the things it does very well, in my opinion, is put human behavior in broader context, encourages like thinking about different points of view, thinking about, why people behave they do, why people believe the things that they do, and trying to grapple with those questions. And I think that that's a great sort of foundational set of ideas to grapple with for science communication. Given what I said earlier about sort of um, where the field seems to be landing. So I spent a lot of time, doing science, mostly in primate behavioral ecology work. I did work in Costa Rica with white-faced capuchins. Um, I did
Hmm.
uh, I did some work with captive populations. Most of my PhD and then postdoctoral work was at Gombe National Park in Tanzania, which of course is the site founded by Jane Goodall and which is still very active today, 60 some years later. Um, so I was doing science, I was enjoying science, but as my postdoc ended, was casting around looking for kind of okay next steps, more postdocs, tenure track jobs, and what I realized was that I had young children. I have two young children. I have a partner who's very happy with her career, and I just wasn't willing to make the sacrifices needed to kind of aggressively pursue tenure track positions. And I decided, okay, I don't think that I'm going to stay in kind of the tenure track route. I need to find something else. And so it happened that I was living in DC, which was, and I think despite everything remains, a good place for people who are interested in science and society issues and science education and things like that. So I started looking around for jobs in the DC area, all kinds of jobs, teaching jobs, communication jobs, writing jobs. And it just happened that on the AAAS website, they were advertising for, at the time, it was a senior program associate position for a faith community engagement project. And I had some, at that point, I had some experience in that domain. I think many of us who've taught human origins and evolution have had, experiences engaging with undergraduates who are, challenged or, trying to navigate worldview, their own worldview, their family's worldview and identity that may be very important to them, and some of the topics that are explored in biological anthropology, human origins, sex and gender, human difference. And so I had that experience when I was teaching at University of Southern California for my graduate work. We actually would take as an extra credit assignment, we would have a field trip down to a creation museum in Santee, California, near San Diego. Not to mock, but just to kind of respectfully engage with sort of this worldview that is very prominent in American society, and better understand it, and to ask questions and to reflect on it later. So this was important to me. This questions about so how do we best engage with people of faith, with faith communities, about science, not just about evolution, but about science in general. So that was my transition really into sort of professional science communication. I had some experience, but I would not say that I had expertise. And the
Mm.
expertise really was acquired on the job. And I was tremendously fortunate at AAAS in having colleagues. And at the time, AAAS had a Center for Public Engagement with Science and Technology, which is now closed. Um, Practitioners, people with real expertise, to help me kind of learn on the job, helped me find great programs that were happening, engage with the science of science communication research, which is by now is quite deep and rich, which is fantastic. And that's really where a lot of where I developed some expertise and better networks and a deeper understanding of what it means to do good science communication and public engagement with science. Um, and that program, which was called the Engaging Scientists in the Science and Religion Dialogue, ran for about 5 years. You can check out some of the outputs of that on the Dozer website, which we can maybe post somewhere. It's
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, sciencereligiondialogue.org. We had interviews with different scientists talking and faith leaders and science communicators talking about their experiences. We had a number of events at different science societies, including what was then AAPA, now AABA,
Mhm.
highlighting scientists, engaging with faith communities, in some cases grappling with their own religious identity, but also talking about science in a cultural context more generally, because that's very relevant. And that was really that whole project was really, I think, one of the proudest things I've ever done in my life. I really feel very strongly about the positive things that came out of that in terms of videos and events and this profile series that is still running at Dozer. Um, and then more recently, in the last few years, I shifted to this new position at PG Ed. So personal genetics education and dialogue is focused on genetics and its applications. So it's a narrower range of science, but a
Mhm.
broader range of audiences. And I'm not a geneticist, so it's been again, a lot of learning on the job for me. But the work that we do is still very aligned with the work that I have been doing at AAAS and what I see as kind of these best practices: human-centered, audience-centered, uh, looking to looking to create opportunities for dialogue and connection, and not focusing on one-way, knowledge transfer, putting science in its social context, and grappling with challenges of trust and trustworthiness, which again I think are also so critical. And that's been again tremendously rewarding experience, and I learn on the job every day.
I think that is, something only so many people dream of, a job that they can learn every day, do something new every day. I know that's something that I hope to have when I get to a situation like that. And, in today's world, what you're doing is critically important, communicating science and especially involving human origins, human genetics, what brings us together, what makes humans, more similar than we are different. Now, this must be quite challenging, I would assume, in today's atmosphere, shall we say. What challenges are you seeing in real time? And this is a little different than I've spoken with my other guests because we usually focus, more on fossils, paleoanthropology, but I thought we could have a more open conversation on what's going on in science communication right now and why it's so critical. You have colleagues who I assume have been completely axed, fired. Um, how do you see science communication being affected over the next decade with advancements in technology, but also with the clashing political sphere we're currently finding ourselves in?
Very heavy questions. Something I should say is all my comments on this podcast are reflecting my own personal views. I'm not
Mhm.
representing my program or Harvard Medical School or Harvard University. Um, it is a challenging moment for sure. Um, maybe I'll take the question of technology, like advances in
Yeah.
technology first. I mean, I think something that remains true. This is one of the very first articles I ever read about science communication years ago. An insight from it is that most science learning happens outside the classroom.
Mm.
Um, and the statistic that I read then, and I have not found more current statistics, but I imagine it hasn't dramatically changed, is that about 30% of US adults have taken a university level science class. So most learning happens outside classrooms. You know, less than 1 in 3 or about 1 in 3 US adults take a science class at the college level. What that means is that um, when people are learning science, and I should add one other insight that I think remains true is that most US adults are really interested in science and learning about science, are supportive of funding of scientific research and investing in technology, investing in medicine. These are very broadly shared areas of interest and excitement for the US public. It gets a little bit more complicated abroad, and we can talk about that if time permits. But in the U.S. context, okay, so supportive of science, a lot of learning outside of classrooms. So what that means is that um, those of us who are really interested in supporting uh, a civic culture where science is valued and understood, where people are engaged in science, are equipped to understand and apply scientific ideas in their lives, to ask the right questions in the doctor's office, or in the grocery store, and reading an article in the newspaper. We need to be engaging with people where they are. Classroom education is great, is important, but maybe at least as impactful and maybe more impactful is the letter you write to your local paper, or the career day you do at your local school, or serving as a merit badge counselor for your local Boy Scout troop, or you know uh, giving a guest sermon on Earth Day at your local church or synagogue. That is where we can have real impacts. In the sense of like changes in technology, I mean, I think I smarter people than I think, are struggling to predict like where social media will go. But it does seem like things are becoming more fractured than they had been maybe 5 or 10 years ago in terms of X versus blue sky, in terms of
Mm.
how people use platforms like LinkedIn, in terms of YouTube versus TikTok versus Instagram. Like there are all these different channels. I'm not on half of these channels, and
Right,
I'm,
right.
I'm ambivalent about the ones that I'm on. Um, so so there's that. There's the decline in sort of print journalism and these kind of very local media. Um, there's the rise of AI, which is also like maybe beyond the scope of our conversation, but maybe I'll just say is cause for concern in terms of how images can be manipulated, and things
Hmm.
maybe you know can't always trust what we see online or what's communicated to us. I think that part of that addressing that challenge is focusing again more on like human connection, where you have real relationships, meaningful relationships, virtually or in person, with real people. That is where you should start, and that's where you're maybe most likely to have impacts. In terms of the broader challenges of science and society, I think it is a really hard time to be. I mean, it's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity in for science communication. The policy decisions that are being made at the federal level, um, uh, in which very extensive cuts are happening across the board in medicine, in engineering, um, is devastating an entire generation of scientists. Um, There restrictions on um, academic freedom, I think, are very real and rising. Restrictions on um, the international element of scientific collaboration, where student visas are now um, much more challenging to get, or being revoked, or it's maybe dangerous for you to be in this country if you're a visiting scientist. All that is very real. Um, and some of these cuts are hitting, like at the NSF, some of these cuts are hitting particularly hard in terms of um, supporting more diverse representation in science. A lot of NSF is mandated by Congress to support broadening participation in STEM. And yet, many of the programs that support or have historically supported broadening participation in STEM are now gone, particularly
Mhm.
those that support women and minoritized and marginalized communities. Would also
Right.
say, for disclosure, I was a PI on an NSF grant that was canceled. That was in this scope of broadening participation in STEM. So this also touched me personally. Um, so it is a challenging moment. I would say that the solution to or part of the solution to dealing with that is recognizing that if we didn't understand it before, we sure understand it now, that science occurs in a social, political, economic, cultural context. How research decisions, decisions about how research is funded, who gets money, what kind of questions can be asked, um, what kind of support exists to advance um, uh, stated goals of, for example, broadening participation in STEM, like what kind of supports exist for that. Um, it is not separate from society. It is deeply entwined with everything else that's happening in society. Um, and that has to inform how we move forward. And I think, again, like I don't have a solution for the broader challenge, but I think that
Mhm.
the most immediate challenge for people who are interested in talking about science, feel like science is under threat. Think about, there's a quote from a Jesuit priest, Daniel Berrigan, that I like a lot, which is, "Stand where you must stand and be human there." And look for your local opportunity, look for your most immediate community that you can be a part of, and engage with and support and offer what you can in whatever domain you can. And um, you know, in a really challenging moment for science and medicine, like your scientific expertise, your understanding, your ability to maybe understand scientific literature, to parse through competing narratives about what the science says, or um, how to navigate different ideas about, like, institutional trust. Like,
Right.
you have things to offer, and look for where you can be supportive in the networks and communities that you are already a part of.
And those are all excellent points, I think, especially in the times that we are facing right now. And, I think you make some very clear and good points. And in in your experience, obviously, as you just mentioned, a lot has changed over even just the past few months.
Mhm.
Traditionally, what are some of the biggest challenges that science communicators face traditionally? And then going back a little bit, I know you just talked about it, but how have those challenges now may have been exasperated? And maybe what can we do as science communicators to try to mitigate those issues?
So I think a longstanding issue in science communication is that it's often perceived or experienced as at odds with the doing of science. So if you spend a lot of time in doing public outreach or, writing op-eds or creating, being involved in like popular media documentaries or something like that, then you're maybe going to be perceived as a less serious scientist
Hmm.
because this work would all be, but in this mindset, this work is all at the expense of the real work, pumping out more papers and things like that. I think unfortunately that remains true that um, while I think public engagement and I don't really like the term outreach, but public outreach um, is, I think, seen as more than it used to be seen as part of what it means to be a scientist, is aligned with, NSF's requirements for broader impacts, that you're doing something to show that this matters to, the US public. Um, it's still not very deeply factored into things like tenure decisions or promotion
Hmm.
decisions, things like that. I think outside of sort of tenure track work, these positions tend to not pay very well. They tend to be, soft money. Um, a lot of expertise is expected, but not necessarily the right level of compensation.
Right.
So I think that's a challenge. I think also it's worth noting that like there are many different frameworks for public engagement with science or science communication, and they can be very different. So just as one example, so our program, PG Ed, is a very we strive very hard to not advance particular perspectives or opinions about genetics. Like we try to be extremely balanced in our approach. We talk about, you know, uh, we try to communicate what we understand to be like facts or best current knowledge or current thinking, without a lot of advocacy for like, you know, gene editing is great or gene editing is going to ruin the world or anything like that. Um, there are other topics where I think, understandably, there is a bit more urgency to um, push. There tends to be a bit more urgency to push people in particular directions. For example, like addressing vaccine hesitancy. Like the goal in engaging with vaccine hesitancy is to maybe reduce vaccine hesitancy, um, and that is important work. A lot of the same principles of sort of science communication will apply, but it is worth acknowledging that like it is different. It is different if you are trying to convince someone to behave or think differently than to just kind of build curiosity and wonder about genetics. Um, and so that kind of thing, I think, can sometimes be hard to internalize, that like there are different frameworks that come up within science communication that you just have to be very mindful of.
Yeah, and being mindful about how we communicate things and what we're communicating, I know is absolutely critical. When we first did, wow, is it 2 years ago now? 3 years ago, when we were at the Los Angeles National History Museum,
Yeah, 2 years ago.
um, 2 years ago. I remember I wanted to prepare on, how to handle myself and whatnot, and one of our colleagues and friends, Dr. Brianna Pobiner, told me a lot of ways to communicate and how important it was to not alienate people while trying
Mhm.
to communicate these themes, because as soon as you challenge their ideas, they shut down. And once someone shuts down, they're no longer going to be receptive to what you're trying to communicate. How do you think we can reach people who are, I don't know if you maybe you know of her, what's her name? I'm trying to think of her real name. Gut Sick Given, Erica, I can't remember her name. She has a YouTube channel, and she very often will debate creationists in a very
Mhm.
polite, educated, very fact-based way. And there is a very special way you have to talk to certain individuals. And I remember when we were at the Natural History Museum, one lady came up to me and she said she actually told her daughter to tell me the story of Genesis while we were at the table. And
Hmm.
it just made me very curious as to why they were even at the museum to begin with. But how do you deal with people who are combative when you're trying to communicate science and might be just they want to fight you over it? Do you disengage? Do you try to change the narrative?
I will answer that. I want to back up to one thing you were just talking about. So,
Yeah.
like you reflected like, oh, I'm curious, like why they were at the
Right.
museum. So, do you remember what that day was?
It was homeschool day. Yeah.
Right, right. So like I think a good attitude, and I've done a lot of museum outreach as
Mhm.
well. People don't come to the museum because they're looking for a fight. The
Yeah.
vast majority people come to the Natural History Museum or Natural History Museum because they're interested. They want to learn about animals. They want to see these incredible videos from about space. They want to go to visit the Geology Museum. They want to see, you know, uh, art. They want like people are not coming to museums because they are looking for a fight. And I most people. And I think that the best approach, I mean, like with the little girl talking about Genesis, I mean, I think it's great. I think it's great to, in that situation, like my advice, I don't know how you handled it, but like my advice is like meet it with enthusiasm and like,
Yeah.
ask what did you love about your trip to the museum today? Or like
Yeah. Yeah.
or like about Genesis, like what about that story really speaks to you about like how the world works? I mean, it's all fine. It's all learning. And in that situation, in any kind of like public engagement setting, like, but particularly in a situation where like you're maybe only going to interact with someone for 30 seconds, or a minute, they're not going to remember. And I think this is a Maya Angelou quote. I'm going to butcher, but like people won't remember what you said, but they'll remember how you made them feel.
Mm, yes.
And let let that my advice in that type of setting is the mom and the daughter should leave that interaction with you, even if they came in a little bit hot, feeling like they were listened to and respected, and you met them with enthusiasm and empathy. And then to the question about like someone who comes in hostile or aggressive, I certainly had that experience. I mean, I've seen people in tears at the National Museum of Natural History in DC, like leaving the Hall of Human Origins in tears. Um,
Yeah.
and I think I try to meet that with enthusiasm in the sense that, you know, um, asking questions, so what do you find challenging or um, uh, what's really spoken to you or what in this hall has been really, challenging for you to engage with. I think meeting it with curiosity is good. I think I have a pretty high tolerance for this is speaking for personally. This is not necessarily what I would advocate for everyone. I have a pretty high tolerance for people being a little bit rude to me. So like I, I'm willing to extend a lot of grace. If someone is if someone is angry or maybe feeling emotional, big feelings, as I might tell my 10-year-old daughter, but is still engaging in good faith, like I'm willing to engage with that. I will say though that I've developed a bit of a sensitivity to when I feel like people are trolling me, or trying to waste my
Mm,
time, and I'm not really into that. So if I feel like it's that type of interaction where someone is trolling me or not really engaging in good faith or not really willing to have a real conversation, then I disengage,
yeah.
politely, but it's just not constructive. And the risk is if you do continue to engage is that, there's bystander effects of people kind of see, you know, someone advocating for evolution and someone advocating for other perspectives kind of going at it, and it just kind of reinforces a negative
Right.
perception of this, which is not constructive and not enjoyable and not really what I want to be doing at a museum. So you just have to I've developed a little bit of a sensitivity where if I feel like it's a bad faith engagement, I will disengage. But um, I also say that, I mean, I'm an enormous white guy. I have a PhD, so like I have a lot of unearned privilege and authority that, like, I know that accepting a little bit of heat and aggression is not going to be feasible for everyone and shouldn't be feasible
Yeah,
for everyone. Um, so I'm also mindful of that I can navigate that maybe a little bit more easily than others.
absolutely. Absolutely. I like how you put that. And I think it's very commendable of you that you're able to navigate those waters so, I wouldn't say easily, but freely, perhaps.
Yeah. And I'll add that in my experience, so when I was at Dozer, and still honestly in some of the work that I do at PG Ed, and we've done engagement with religious communities in Omaha and in the Boston area. I'm looking to do more in the DC area.
Mhm.
Um, and it's mostly fine. It's mostly fine. If you approach these conversations with it has to be genuine, not feigned, but like genuine, like understanding that like you are not necessarily going to be changing people's minds, but you want to kind of share what you know and ask questions and give people a chance to ask questions. Like it's mostly fine. Now, granted, like these are mostly going to be like self-selected people who like come
Mhm.
to an event, come to an event that I'm a part of. Like these are people who are already kind of in the mindset of science religion
Right.
dialogue and things like that. But it's mostly fine. And so just I would encourage people to not kind of approach um, these types of interactions in classrooms or in public settings as like necessarily adversarial, because that's honestly a rare occurrence in my experience. People don't come to science festivals to fight with you. They come to science
Yeah.
festivals because they're interested in science. And if they encounter something that's a little bit challenging or engages with some big feelings, like it's actually, I think, mostly on you to figure out how to make them feel welcome
Mhm.
and comfortable. Um, so I'll yeah.
No, absolutely. And I think that's a great reflection of this little event that I did about a year ago. I used to work for this after school program in a very small town, very minority filled town filled with I think a majority of Catholic
Mm.
families. And the head of the after school program was a cultural anthropologist. He got his degree at UC Davis, and he knew I was doing bioanth at the time. And he asked me to actually, for our little like back to school night after school program thing, to do some sort of thing with my skulls, 3D printed skulls that I have. Brianna helped me put a little lesson plan together where we would measure the skulls and the different points and look at the change over time. And I was so nervous. I was like,
Mm.
all these families are Catholic. They are like they're Hispanic. They're very religious. Like this is not going to go well. Like I need backup. This is not. Everyone was so happy. They were so interested. They were so curious. Did any of them understand exactly what I was saying? I don't know. Does it matter? Probably not, because like you said, they left feeling like they got taught something that maybe the world of science isn't so big and scary, which I think is the goal of science communication is to take this huge world that has been behind an ivory tower for so long and take it to people who don't have access, who can't go to college, who don't have the resources available, and really just show them what we've learned about the world and provide them with that access. And I think people like you and the work that you've done with the various organizations that you've mentioned and what you do for your job is just a very continuing effort of that.
Yeah, I would add, I think an important element of that dynamic is not, I mentioned earlier, I don't like the term outreach. And the reason I
Yeah.
don't like the term outreach, and I want to credit Savannah Martin, who kind of first shared this with me, who's a biologist, anthropologist. Outreach suggests that you have something that you are offering to someone, but you could maybe take it back.
Mm,
And so that there's a power, the subtext is that you are retaining the power. You are outreaching, but you're keeping something.
yeah.
And so I use and maybe overuse the term engagement a lot because like it should not just be if we were genuine about like putting science in its social context and like genuine
Hmm.
about like multidirectional dialogue, it should not just be, we should always strive to move beyond this idea where like we are sharing with um, communities or sharing with learners. It should also be we are open to learning ourselves. We are open to
Absolutely.
that. We are open to kind of hearing, you know, why should you know rural communities in South in the Southwest care about human origins and evolution? Like that is a question we should be thinking about in our if we're doing outreach in that context. And like, what are the ways in which this research has been exclusionary to communities, and what are ways in which we can highlight, whether it's in terms of highlighting scientists from different communities, in terms of highlighting, um, intersections with, local archaeology, in terms of intersections with, you know, uh, climate change or other things impacting communities. Like that our mindset, and it's not always possible. Sometimes these links are not always easy to find, but like we should always be asking ourselves, why should this matter to anyone? Why should this matter to this community? Because if you don't have that answer, then that's maybe a signal that we should be reflecting on what we're doing there. Who is this actually for?
Right.
If we can't articulate why this is relevant to this community.
Absolutely. And that brings up something that I like to say, especially when, we do work with minority groups, is you shouldn't do the work without the people
Yes,
involved.
yes,
And,
absolutely.
when it comes to science communication and things like that, if we don't know what the group needs, if we don't know what the people need or why they need it, we can't provide the proper resources. And that actually leads to my next and potentially my last question, which you kind of a little bit answered just now. And that is, it's a very broad question, but I'll narrow it a little bit. Why is science communication, specifically on human origins, important? And why should we as a society invest time, resources, money in spreading science communication engagement about human origins?
Um, that's a great question. I think that uh, at the kind of a very broad philosophical level, as is the title of your series, like it is our story. It is like our
Yeah.
shared story. And I think that um, finding ways to tell that story or acknowledge the different versions of that story, because we don't have a full consensus, and maybe never will, I think is important. I do think that um, there are real parallels between understanding the human story and very immediate challenges that U.S. society or human society at large faces. How do we live together? How do we respond to environmental challenges? Um, how do we understand questions of human difference, whether that's in terms of sex, gender, and sexuality, in terms of disability, um, in terms of neurodiversity? Like the evolutionary context is relevant, I think, for and like an understanding like other types of humans that we've shared the earth with in terms of understanding like how humans have lived or human ancestors have lived in the past, or the diversity of human experiences in the present. I think all this is really relevant to these big challenges. Um, so I think that that's probably my answer. Is that I think that it's our shared story, and it really does. I think not in like a facetious way, but in like a very genuine way, does connect with some of the big challenges that we face as a society today. And so I think that that's one of the ways in which it's really relevant and important.
I really like that answer. And I think it's a great way to close this episode. I think you've really opened up, cracked open the shell of why science communication, why engagement is important, and why we need to move forward as a group and as a collective society in learning these things so that we can better provide a future that is more beneficial for everyone. And as I always like to say, the way that we do that, the way that we provide a better future for everyone is by studying the past and our past successes, our past failures.
Mhm.
And we we do that in anthropology. And I know that it's a passion of yours to communicate what you learn, and that learning is obviously such a huge passion of yours. And I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been very enlightening to hear kind of some of the background of what goes on in science communication and the views of just someone who's been doing it in the the depths of it for quite a bit now, and the challenges that we face as a society. Is there anything you'd like to close with before I end this episode?
I think that scientists, science advocates, educators, anyone who's passionate about this, you know, the role of science in society, I do encourage you to think about how you can be a part of those conversations, foster those conversations wherever you are. Um, it can be overwhelming, like looking at kind of the state of the world and being like, oh my gosh, I can't fix these problems. And you're probably right in the sense of, you can't fix the big problems. Start where you are locally, be human where you are
Mm-hmm.
locally. And like just as one example, like I'm a scoutmaster, like we do civic stuff all the time. This weekend I was on a whole bunch of panels talking about human animal relations and humans in extreme environments at a science fiction convention. Like you can find the communities that you are a part of already and and be human there. That is best advice I can give.
Absolutely. And I can't agree more. I think most beneficial things start at the local communal level and build up from there. So I fully agree with that. I want to thank you so much, Dr. Rob O'Malley, for coming on the Three of Us. It has been an absolute pleasure. We hope to see you again soon when there is maybe some more to report on the status of science communication and
When
engagement.
we solved it, when we solved
Yes, when
everything.
it's been solved.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Well, thank you very much, Seth. I appreciate it, and thank you for all the work that you do as well.
Thank you. All right, everyone. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe. It's been a great time, and we'll see you next time.